Hello again and welcome to ISAC Software Academy Linux course. In this lesson we will be covering drivers in Linux and also some Windows drivers later on down the track as an example. A quick explanation of what a driver is for those who are unaware. A driver is designed to interface between the operating system and a specific type of hardware. The operating system sends a specific type of message and the driver understands that message and translates it into a message that the hardware understands. And then once the hardware is done doing its thing, the reverse occurs. The hardware sends a message to the driver sends a message to the operating system. Now this is true in both Linux as well as Windows. However, there are some specific cases where the operating system and the driver are actually one and the same, which we'll get into later. In most instances, Linux is capable of detecting your hardware and providing either a specific or a generic driver that is more than capable of doing the tasks required of it. Specifically, the drivers, for example, your CPU, which is in some cases needed. Sound cards are quite often automatically detected and implemented. Graphics cards are in some cases ready to go pretty much as soon as it's installed. There are various other examples. USB, for example, is usually straight out of the box. Now there are always exceptions to this. It really does depend on the chipsets that each of the pieces of hardware has, and also the amount of support that Linux is able to provide for those chipsets. However, in general, it's on enough different systems that there is generally support for it, no matter what you actually have. These drivers that Linux installs may not work correctly or may not work as efficiently or give the features that you need or want on your system, and in these cases you might find it necessary to find and install drivers specifically for Linux for your hardware in order to get it working in that particular fashion. I've listed some points to remember here. As I've said, it supports a great deal of hardware out of the box. What I haven't mentioned is that it will sometimes support this hardware in the kernel itself, which we'll cover the kernel in greater depth at a later time, but for now just think of it as the software brain of the system. And in this instance, the kernel can actually have the driver required for your hardware. And this is increasingly the case. With more and more up-to-date kernels, there are more and more internally supported hardware types. So you may not even be able to update that particular driver because it's in the kernel without actually updating the kernel itself, which in most people's cases is a rather mammoth task. The other thing to remember is that drivers are not always available for Linux. Sometimes you cannot use a piece of hardware because there is no driver. Generally speaking, however, there will be somebody out there who was in the same boat as you, however, had the knowledge and skill to be able to develop their own driver for that particular piece of hardware. You might be able to find something like this if you're really needing that particular piece of hardware to run. However, keep in mind that it is made by somebody that you do not know, and it's entirely possible that it could be an infection, so just keep that in mind when you go looking for third-party drivers for Linux. Another thing to keep in mind is that Linux can use some of the Windows drivers. It won't be able to use all of them, but in instances where you cannot find a Linux driver, there is a good chance that you'll be able to use a Windows driver on Linux. Another key point to note is rather simple, but something that you should keep in mind. If you're going to install a driver, you first need to know what you are installing. Now, what I mean by this is not that you know what hardware you're installing, but more what version of that hardware, and whether you actually have the correct driver for that version of hardware. There's no point getting a graphics card driver for a 3000 series card when you have a 5000 series card. One is legacy, the other one is the current. Although 5000 will soon be legacy, and therefore the 7000 will be current. So you have to make sure that you have a driver that is for your specific hardware. If it's out, in some cases, by one version number, it can mean that it will not work at all, or could be potentially damaging to your system. You will note that I have said here on the last paragraph that it's very much dependent upon the type of hardware, and this is very true. I've also stated here that we will be installing, in quotes, a graphics drivers. As I have a virtual machine, the graphics drivers are a little bit difficult to install, so we're going to do the best we can with a virtual system so that I can show you how to go through a graphics driver installation. It may not be 100% accurate to what you could expect on a standard system, however, it should at least give you an idea of what you'd be up against. Now, next up are some useful commands when you're installing certain types of drivers. As an example, lsmod is list modules, is what it's short for, and obviously it shows information about the modules that have been loaded. Now, mod probe is obviously for module probe and is capable of handling the modules at a high level. Now, by high level I mean further away from the hardware, so it's a little bit more human level rather than computer level. Next up would be the LSPCI. Now, this one's very useful for when installing a PCI device that you're not familiar with. Doing LSPCI, you'll be able to tell, which obviously is short for list PCI, you'll be able to tell which PCI bus it is on. The last one I've got listed is the insmod command, and this is obviously for installing modules, and this is for installing them into the kernel, because the kernel is somewhat modular in that regard, hence the modules. Next up we'll be doing the more hands-on style for this. Okay, so to save some time I have downloaded, and we will now install an AMD driver, as you can see listed here, which we will simply go into by saying open, which you can just simply double click, but I always prefer to right click. And at that point, so what we're going to do is simply extract this straight to the desktop to make it simpler to use. Now, I do not believe this is going to actually install. I'm simply doing the step-by-step instructions that you'll need in order to actually get to the point of installing it properly. I can also show you how to install the VirtualBox guest editions, but I will have to uninstall them first. And as you can see up here, it has been extracted, so simply double clicking on that will actually just give us Gedit, which is an editing software, which we don't want. In this instance I'm going to have to force quit. What you need to do, as I've demonstrated before, is go into the terminal and into desktop, and should be able to simply do this. and there we go, it's now executable. So double clicking on it now gives us some options. Obviously we want to run it. As you can see, it extracts out some temporary files here into the install folder here. Would actually be getting a lot of text if I'd done this still in a terminal window. However, you can also see in this, assuming it doesn't disappear on us, all of the files that it's going to be using. Here you can see the graphical installation for this driver. At this point it's going to complain because it can't see the AMD graphics card I actually have in this system. However, simply saying continue and I get this error message here. However, you would have some options to deal with there and it would be a step-by-step thing. In this instance I can't go any further. However, I can go into the system settings and show you through additional drivers, which is quite often where you will have graphics drivers come from. In this instance I have the VirtualBox guest editions here and I can deactivate these, which obviously it wants me to authenticate. Now it is still in use, so I have to restart the... Apparently it doesn't want to actually deactivate properly. Try that again. And okay, so you can now see that it has been deactivated and it now states that a different version of this driver is in use. Now in this instance it's actually referring to the Linux version of this driver rather than the Oracle version of this driver. Gets a little confusing there, but the Ubuntu developers have developed for the VirtualBox environment, and Oracle also develops drivers so that their guest operating systems are capable of running within their environment. So it's usually best to go with the most stable. In this instance I prefer to go with the Oracle ones. So obviously it wants a reboot, as you can tell by the red icon up the top here, so I'll simply close this and this, and I will do a restart to complete updates, it believes. And so once that goes through, we will then have the ability to reinstall these drivers. Now keep in mind this is a very similar sort of situation that you'll have on a fresh installation. I have to remove these ones because I've been using them already, and as such the difference here is that you'll only need to do a reboot once you've done the first install. It won't necessarily need to be uninstall, reboot, install again. So at this point it isn't particularly happy with the resizing of the screen, which is understandable without its lack of drivers. So need to go in now and reinstall these drivers so that it's available. Unfortunately at the moment it doesn't seem to like my mouse either, so I'm just going to resize this. Hopefully it fixes it. It doesn't, so I'm going to probably have to use keys in this instance. So we'll activate that now, and at this point in time it should want a reboot. As you can see it's still not particularly happy with my mouse, so don't seem to be able to get to close, so there we go. and I will do a reboot now in order to make sure this is working. Now, you generally won't have this kind of issue. It's only because I've done an uninstall and then had to reinstall it. But in the instance of a graphics driver installation, many things can go wrong, and you need to keep this in mind. Quite often what you'll need to do is uninstall and reinstall, which in itself will develop more problems. So now that it's back and happy, you can see you can go in and you can see the mouse again, and it will slowly load up. There we go, and everything is back to normal. Obviously this driver does not want to install on my system because as far as it's concerned I don't have that graphics card, but you have been through a fairly typical graphics card installation, the only difference being that it was for VirtualBox rather than AMD or NVIDIA. I hope this has helped you to understand how to do any driver installations. Thank you.